Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Wednesday, January 28th. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman. Lazar, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Amanda. Good to be here as always.
It is such a pleasure to chat with you. And today, Master Sergeant Gvili is being set for burial as thousands, tens of thousands of Israelis take to the streets already ahead of his burial to be lining the streets with Israeli flags to see him home to his hometown in Meitar in the south of the country. Last night, our Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made remarks about the return of the final hostage from Gaza and had a wide-ranging press conference that Lazar attended. So we're going to hear all about that and more when we're back.
3 million Israelis are dealing with trauma since October 7th. To help Israelis heal, Hadassah is there, with the largest rehabilitation center in Jerusalem, world-renowned medical centers, and youth villages. It's said, saving a life saves the world. Imagine helping millions. This is Hadassah, a life-changing force in Israel and the world.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman. Master Sergeant Gvili is set for burial today at 2 p.m. in Meitar. And really, the whole country is with this family who never gave up hope that their son would come home alive. But following Operation Courageous Heart, which took place earlier in the week, his remains were returned after 250 bodies were examined by a team of forensics experts in Gaza. This is the end of a promise from the Israeli government, and more specifically, a promise from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In his press conference last night, Netanyahu underlined his role in the return of Gvili home. But the press conference was so wide-ranging, there's any number of headlines that could have come out of it. Lazar, just to begin with, what was the mood in the room?
So the mood, I guess, from Netanyahu and from his hostage envoy, Brigadier General Gal Hirsch, was somewhat mixed. Certainly, you can tell that Netanyahu called a pretty rare press conference in order to double down on the fact, in the eyes of the public, that he had indeed overseen the process that brought all the hostages home. And that certainly is a very big accomplishment. He has an election coming up. There will be questions about his management of the war in Gaza, of the process, of the negotiation process, and whether it could have been done quicker. But he wants to make sure that he emphasizes in the eyes of the voters that he indeed got every last hostage out of Gaza. And for the first time since 2014, there are no Israeli hostages in Gaza. For Gal Hirsch, it was a little bit different. He's not a politician. And he's kind of a different type of person, much more of what you would call kind of a warm, very decent person. And he was very emotional on stage. He thanked a whole range of actors within Israel, internationally, and he even kind of teared up, put on a kippah, and quoted the Tanakh. So kind of very different from both men. But you can tell that I wouldn't call it a victory lap per se, because we're talking about someone who is slain and one of many dozens of hostages who were returned dead. But there was definitely an attempt to present this as a major accomplishment for this government on the part of Netanyahu.
So, as you mentioned, we are in an election year. The final date of the election, possible date, would be the end of October. And during this press conference, of course, you can hear echoes of campaigning already from our prime minister, who said that we should not go to early elections, I believe was one of his comments. But you could also hear a bit of a defensive stance when he was talking about the prosecution of this war, especially in terms of his accusations against former U.S. President Joe Biden.
Yeah, that was so interesting because obviously some of what he talks about is dictated by the questions that come up, and a lot of the questions had to do with the elections, especially from the Hebrew-speaking press. But after the questions were done, and to Netanyahu's credit, every single reporter there got to ask a question. He said, "Oh, I have something else to tell you. Just hold on." And then in Hebrew, he had this kind of prepared. He wasn't reading from any text, but he clearly had a message, and he stressed out of nowhere that Israeli heroic soldiers in Gaza had died because Israel had run out of ammunitions, especially he pointed at artillery shells. Now, during the war, he never said that it got that bad, that they were just had totally run out, and it didn't get that bad, though there was certainly a shortage. And he blamed, without saying exactly the US and Biden, but he blamed weapons embargoes. Obviously, the big one that mattered was the US one. But he did say that that all turned around when Trump came into office. So that is really a pretty explosive charge, saying that Israeli soldiers died in Gaza because of President Biden or because of the people around him that were making decisions when President Biden wasn't. There was a pretty furious reaction from some top aides to President Biden. Amos Hochstein told Axios that that's absolutely a lie. So did Tom Nides, who was the ambassador here. That Israel and Netanyahu should be saying thank you. They pointed at all the support that Biden gave, especially 2 aircraft carriers, and that don't, and keeping Iran ostensibly out of the war, even though that didn't last very long. So it's something else that's really going to infuriate the Democratic Party and make, in America at least, make a lot of Democrats think that Netanyahu is siding entirely with the Republicans, even gratuitously, where this attack didn't need to come out, but it seemed like just Netanyahu wanted to get it off his chest. It could be that he's playing to Trump, that Trump loves to bash on sleepy Joe Biden, quote unquote, whenever he can, even when it's not the topic. And Netanyahu is signaling to him, hey, I'm going to help you out here. I'm going to raise you up, and I'm going to put your political rival down. That could be part of it as well.
That 100% seems to be the reasoning behind this out of the blue statement, because over the past several weeks, shall we say, there is a bit of a disagreement between our Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the US President Donald Trump in terms of this next phase that we're about to launch into, or potentially launch into at least. And our Prime Minister is very adamant that there will be no reconstruction without demilitarization of Hamas, whereas it appears, at least from what we saw in Davos, that the vision of quote unquote new Gaza has already left the station, and the idea of reconstruction is of primary importance to the Board of Peace. So I would see this statement against Biden as a way of kind of mending that bridge a little bit. But what else did our Prime Minister have to say about this next phase?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say there's any break in relations or strain, even though in the press, and maybe I'm guilty of it sometimes too, we like to look for little signs and make a big deal out of them. There's definitely substantive disagreements. There's no question. Maybe less with Trump, but more people around him, like Witkoff and Kushner in Israel. But we've seen over the past year that despite really serious disagreements, including on direct talks with Iran, remember in April, I was in the Oval Office, and Trump just dropped that on Netanyahu, who was sitting next to him. The two leaders and their staffs know how to talk about disagreements in a quiet way and to get beyond them. So even though there was disagreements over Iran, they were able to cooperate quite closely in the June war. And you've seen that throughout. So I don't think right now there's anything that's going to blow up relations. It seems like all indications that Netanyahu and yours truly will be back in the White House in a couple weeks, late February, to talk about this very issue. But there is that disagreement. And Netanyahu's job right now is to forget about all the noise about the Board of Peace and all these other countries that have no interest in actually getting Hamas to disarm, and to tell Trump something very simple. You have a big vision for the Middle East, for the world. You said explicitly that the Board of Peace is about more than just Gaza. Once you get Gaza right, then the whole world and the whole region opens up to a new era, and that is the path to your Nobel Peace Prize as well. But nothing can happen if Hamas hangs on to its arms. So what Netanyahu needs to convince Trump to do now is to give a deadline, a firm deadline, Trump likes those, to Hamas to disarm. It has to be real disarmament. It can't be holding on to Kalashnikovs and all sorts of light arms. And if not, then they are going to face an Israeli military operation, a significant one in Gaza. Now, someone might say, but why on earth would Trump want to go back to all the war that he stopped and all the anger in the Middle East from his Arab friends and from Turkey? Netanyahu can say this war is going to be very different. There's no hostages living or dead in Gaza. There's no reason to hold back. We can do this quickly. Hamas is on its heels. We are rested. We are ready. Give us a few weeks and we can push Hamas into agreeing to give up its arms, leaders into exile, and that will open the way to your larger vision in the Middle East.
We had heard reports earlier, about a month ago, that there is some kind of operation that is being readied for, people have said, March. But the Israeli people doesn't seem to have the appetite to go back to war right now, especially this week, in which we're all feeling a huge sense of relief that there isn't, as you said, since 2014, any Israeli hostage still in the Strip. Do you think that there's a way that this operation could actually take place and Netanyahu regain the premiership in the upcoming elections?
Well, I would say a bigger electoral danger for Netanyahu is to have voters go to the voting booths and Hamas still is armed and still controls almost every Gazan. That would be absolute failure. If the opposition parties were smart about this, they would make that the main campaign issue, besides Haredi non-enlistment. In terms of the idea that if the Israeli public doesn't want to go back to war to finish off Hamas, I would not agree with that. I think if you go to any group of reservists and ask them, what do you want to do? What do you think we should do next in Gaza? I think most of them, almost all of them, and not only reservists, but Israeli public in general, is not putting much stock in the ability of a potential international stabilization force to disarm Hamas or the Board of Peace or anything like that. They feel like the IDF can do it and should do it, and we have let Hamas off the hook. So I think that Netanyahu will face some very difficult questions if we get to June or September or October elections with Hamas still armed. I think he'll be much better off if he can say, I delivered on the hostages, and now I delivered on disarming Hamas. It won't be easy, but I don't think there's a better chance to do it than an IDF operation.
Let's go to a short break.
What if prayer doesn't work? This question strikes us as a distinctly modern one, an outgrowth of the slow disenchantment of the world. But in truth, the question is an old one, and one given space to breathe here.
Welcome to Thoughts and Prayers. I'm your host, Jessica Fisher. Join me on a deep exploration of the relationship between religion and modernity through personal stories, classical texts, and conversations with leading rabbis, scholars, and educators.
You're almost not supposed to be doing this interview.
Our prayers accumulate on God's doorstep, piled outside like an unimaginably tall stack of letters. We cannot give up on the relationship because God doesn't come to the door as quickly as we may like. So let's keep knocking. Perhaps the gates of compassion will be opened.
Join us every week on Thoughts and Prayers, wherever you get your podcasts.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman. So, Lazar, as you noted, every single reporter at the press conference last night was able to ask a question, and your question specifically is of great interest to our listenership. So please tell us, what was your question?
Yeah, I think a lot of the reporters kind of appreciated the question because it was a little bit out of left field because it wasn't Gaza and it wasn't the elections. And I think Netanyahu wasn't entirely prepared for it, but he gave a pretty substantive answer, even though he tried to get away from it. I asked him about this turn that we've seen in terms of Saudi policy. Now, if you remember, in the Biden administration era, especially when Biden came here, all the talk after the initial Abraham Accords in 2020 was, okay, when does Saudi Arabia happen? It was a question of when and not if. And then with Trump coming into office, he kept talking about it. He met with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, in November, and he asked him directly about it as well. And since then, so in the past 2.5 months, you've seen a real change in Saudi posture and rhetoric against Israel, and especially against the UAE, even a little bit against the United States. So they've signed new deals with the Qataris. It looks like Turkey might enter into the Saudi-Pakistani military pact, which would put 3 pretty strong military powers, potentially Egypt as well, together in a military pact. You've seen some pretty harsh anti-Israel and anti-Semitic rhetoric in Saudi press. Of course, that's not a free press. So I asked him, do you think normalization is still possible? You don't talk about it anymore. And how do you explain this Saudi pivot? And he said something interesting. He said, we're not ignoring it. We are following it. So he's aware of that. He agrees with my assessment. And he said, we still want normalization with the Saudis, but we expect someone that wants peace with us not to be joining these efforts that are anti-peace, anti-Israel. We expect someone that wants peace with us to make peace with a strong and secure Israel. I think there was a lot there, if you can read between the lines. And it did make some hay in terms of, some foreign press and some of the Israeli press as well. It was an interesting and revealing comment, not something that he wanted to talk about, but you can read between the lines there that Saudi normalization is not something that Israel expects to happen soon. It's something that may be down the road, but something has to change in terms of the Saudi posture. It's that you don't see that Israel's begging for it right now. We're saying we have conditions and we have an expectation for our future friends in the way they behave.
I just have a follow-up about what you said about some kind of military agreement between Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, I think you said Egypt, and what was the
Turkey.
other country? And
Turkey.
Turkey. That's so fascinating if you think about the other regional military cooperations that we have. And if I'm not mistaken, Lazar, about 4 years ago or so, Saudi Arabia began cooperating with Israel, correct? In the CENTCOM cooperation effort?
Yeah, but I mean, that wasn't really, they don't have a choice there. Once the U.S. brought Israel into their CENTCOM area of responsibility, then all the countries that want to cooperate, the U.S. there, have to cooperate with each other as well. But there wasn't any noise made by Saudi Arabia, in terms of the regional security architecture against Iran. If you think about the two Iranian missile and drone attacks in 2024, yeah, Saudis were a part of that in defending Israel. So this, if it emerges, this agreement between Muslim states would be something quite different. The question is whether it's just rhetorical, it's just a signal, or whether there could be some real meat there, because you have Turkey, which is a serious military power. You have Saudis who have a lot of money. The Pakistanis have a nuclear weapon. It could be something. It depends how much they want to pursue this. They all have very different outlooks and very different ideologies, but it is absolutely something that's worrying and something to keep an eye on.
Thanks for putting it on our radar. Now, let's turn to events in Ukraine yesterday. And yesterday was the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, something that I overlooked to mention yesterday in our podcast because we were so focused on the return of the final hostage, Gvili. But in Ukraine, the president marked it at a special ceremony that he attends, I believe, almost every year. It's just such an interesting commemoration because, of course, it was the Soviet Union's liberation of Auschwitz that particular day, January 26th, that we are marking. And, of course, ties are very fraught between these countries, Ukraine and Russia. So tell us a little bit about this commemoration, Lazar.
Yeah, you make a very good point that it was the Red Army that liberated, much of the camps, in Poland and other places as well. And certainly Ukraine was part of the Red Army, but Vladimir Putin has presented his fight against Ukraine as a continuation of that. That's why he calls the Ukrainians Nazis. That's a way to rally the glory of the great patriotic war against the same type of ideology in his mind, of course, ignoring the fact that Zelensky himself is Jewish. But Zelensky, who before the war didn't really embrace his Jewish identity very much, has certainly leaned into it during the 3+ years of war, almost 4 years of war now. And he does go to the Babi Yar commemoration sometimes twice a year because there's the day it happened itself and also the International Holocaust Commemoration Day. So he was there. I must say that Kyiv is in a very, very desperate state right now. The Russians have been targeting energy supply and water supplies. So, it's just dark at night. There's not heating. The government has told people to leave Kyiv if you can even. So the fact that he's still making time to publicly and openly go to that, I think, is very significant. His foreign minister was there. Other senior Ukrainian officials, and 30 ambassadors, 30 Western ambassadors were there as well. So I think a significant event, and something that it's good to see that these people are still turning out to it, and that Zelensky is making time in the midst of a very difficult winter and a very difficult war to make sure that he is doing that very publicly, and everyone is seeing the importance of commemorating what happened to the Jews, not only across Europe, but also in Ukraine as well.
Lazar, thank you so much for all of that you brought today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by The Podwaves and Ari Schlacht. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.